Greetings. So I had some technical issues with the last video lecture for Module 5 and getting some also issues with the feedback on the videos, which is why I shared the film in a separate link. I'm seeing that it's when I share video over Zoom and record it, it doesn't come out clean. So if I have video content, I'll share it separately just to avoid that in the future. But I was going to skip through some of the I wanted to skip through the film to get to kind of the main parts and also to kind of control kind of the movement of the film and kind of your engagement with it. Because we were not in a classroom space, we don't have time to process the film and the the grotesque nature of the violence that was slavery. So if you choose to watch it, it's up to you. But I think it serves as a case study for um, you know, the slavery and the different dimensions of it and the different um, as we the, the dimensions, the breadth, the depth of it, and how it challenges and some of the things that we're discussing and that Winters and Fanon are bringing to the table makes us rethink, slavery in terms of its utility. Generally think of it as economically motivated, and in the video you'll see that for sure. But you'll see that there's some other things at play in terms of there's other stakes in other stakeholders who are invested in maintaining this slave population uh, or this outgroup population that's not just simply economically motivated. Um, and so, if you want to again lean in, it's not required. If you choose to go, lean in as much as you can, pull from it, extract from it what you will, and then use that to kind of you can use that as you're going through your critical reviews. And any aspect of the course, your critical reviews, key concepts, you could pull these things together and again make connections. Um, Couple of terms with this that I wanted to discuss more thoroughly um, is the idea of agency. I think a couple of terms, actually three. The idea of agency. So when you're talking about agency, we're talking about simply free will. Now, again, thinking about the film Goodbye Uncle Tom, it's easy to assume that, assume who has free will and who doesn't in the film. It's easy to sit with, okay, of course, those who have free will are actually free, the non-slave class. And those without free will are the slaves. So when we think about agency, we're talking about free will. Now, if Fanon, if what Fanon is saying is true, then it throws into question this whole notion of free will, because he's asserting that none of us do. That these claims of ontology, these constructs that we use that define our lives, do so in such a way that we become basically artificial intelligence ourselves. We are the computer program. Uh, so he throws it all into question, forces us to kind of all of us to existentially sit with the idea that maybe, you know, I have free will? At least ask the question. So when we think about free will, again, thinking about it in parallel with what Fanon is arguing, it makes us rethink, who actually has free will. If these things, these constructs are defining or over defining and determining our existence. In the film, let me show you one thing. Going back to Black Skin, White Mask. And when he's talking about the zone of non-being, so he doesn't leave it just kind of hanging. It's, not just a one sentence, it's one of probably larger paragraphs in this opening section. Um, uh, uh, let's see here. Well, it's a longer paragraphs. But he doesn't just say, hey, there's a no zone of, he says in the sentence before, at the risk of arousing the resentment of my colored brothers, I will say that the black is not a man. Again, based upon what Winters is discussing or describes, you know, this outgroup, that's it's not a man based upon this European, the different developments in European thought or European formation, identity formation. The black sits outside of that construct. So based upon the terms or the descriptive statements or definitions within this kind of European mind, the black is not a man because he doesn't exist within those confines or within that construct. So he says, I would say the black is not a man within this European construct. There is a zone of non-being, an extraordinarily sterile and arid region, an utterly naked declivity where, key point, an authentic upheaval can be born. Think about that. In most cases, the black man lacks the advantage of being able to accomplish this descent into a real hell. So what Fanon is saying that yes, the black is positioned within this outgroup, but because the black, he or she, is put by the fact that they're positioned outside, it there is something generative of being part of that outside group. Du Bois talks about this in Souls of Black Folk as well, when he's talking about the veil. But he says, and Du Bois talks about it as giving, black people a second sight. Like if there's a where you're situated outside, you can see things different from those who are trapped within. So if that's the case, one, how do you take advantage of this authentic upheaval? Do you fight with your might to get inside, what we can call the prison of our minds? Or do we do something else? Fanon wants us to do something else from this position. He says we can or we have to. Do we negotiate? Maybe. But then again, the question of agency. Are those who are trapped, quote unquote, in this prison of the mind and don't know it, free? Do they exercise free will? Or those who exist outside of it, who can take advantage of this this arid region where an authentic upheaval can be born. This idea of authentic upheaval can we're going to get into some of the theories, and in the next video, I'll cover an overview of them. But what is this authentic upheaval? Maybe you'll pick up on it in the video. Is it the work of the intellectual? Is it the work of the intellectuals we've been studying and discussing in this class? Are they creating or attempting to create this authentic upheaval? But there's an advantage to being on the outside. Now, the risk is, just leaving it there and saying, okay, yes, there's an advantage being on the outside of the in group because you're not free in some regard. Those on the in group think they're free, but they're really not. But that doesn't negate the fact that being on the outside makes you vulnerable to various and myriad forms of violence, as you'll also see in the film. So, if you have any questions about that, I encourage you to engage in the my I renamed the open Q&A to open forum where y'all can kind of discuss these things. I'm checking in on those forums. So if there's things I can, I can add insight with, I will. The other thing is the idea of postmodernity. And again, this is where we see this turn. And although the term postmodernity was coined in the 70s, it was coined to talk about this period in the 60s where the Western modernity was challenged. The objective truth of Western modernity, the scientific biological fact of being that was in that this kind of secular notion of beingness that was introduced through the science, that justified the racial hierarchies or, um, we see now being challenged by various groups. Now, I would say most in their beginnings, many of those groups were invested in this authentic upheaval to not only challenge Western man or man too, but to dismantle Western man and maybe create something new, a new version of society. But um, I I and Sylvia Wynter, as we see in the article on No Human Involved, argue that ultimately those groups fell for the wiles and guiles of Western man and were compulsed to conform, to adapt, or simply just challenge Western man's claim to the throne. So they want to be the king, queen, they, them, they want to control the Iron Throne rather than dismantle it. So we're fighting over competing versions of reality and this claim to the natural status of beingness. And I draw again from this biblical reference of Moses, when God told Moses to go, share the word, the message with the masses of Hebrews. Moses asked God, "Who should I say sent them?" God responded to Moses, "Tell him I am sent him." See, because if God would have ended that statement with a statement, he had to keep that statement open, otherwise he would no longer be God. If he would have closed it, tell him I am this or that, then we're now constricting God to, who is all powerful, omniscient, everywhere at all times, to a fixed space. And therefore she, or they, or them, whatever, would no longer be God. So rather than being comfortable with the ambiguity of beingness, psychoanalysis, in the 50s and prior to kind of this postmodern term, we're engaged in this kind of dialogue and debate around beingness and the direction and what is therapy? Is it to ease us our anxieties around kind of how we fit within the construct of reality? Or so that was one of the arguments, yes. So, how we fit or if society fits within us. The other was something a little more provocative. How do we address those anxieties? Where do they start from? Where do they generate from? But how do we become comfortable with ambiguity? And that's a thread in psychotherapy that is no longer, it's no longer popular. In many instances, you can be canceled if you if you even suggest or even bring up a question of existence and people's claims to existence and why we're claiming existence. Oh, how our claims or desires are basically imitations of the folks we are critiquing. This is what Fanon was on to. This is one of the reasons why Fanon left the field of psychotherapy, or he was a psychiatrist practicing, psychoanalytic theory with his clients. So when you think about this postmodern turn, this moment in the 60s, where different groups were raising hell, and ultimately, as we see progressing to the 70s and 80s, many of those groups just this rather than challenge, they asked for a more comfortable seat within Western modernity. And we see this, and some are still, and I'm not saying that they're still challenging. Some are still challenging, but again, it's not necessarily to dismantle Western modernity or our assumptions about existence, but how to have a more comfortable seat, or how to get the world to accept my version of reality, but not just accept my version of reality, but think my version of reality. So my version of reality is true, absolute truth, rather than all versions of reality are subjective truths. They're interpretations of reality. And to not belong to a truth, and this is where we're going to pick up on this again in Afro-pessimism, to not belong to a subjective truth or have access to a subjective truth. According to Afro-pessimists, that places you in the zone of non-being. And nobody wants to be there. So when you see, again, I refer to the text white by law, differing groups of people fighting to be non-Black, because being Black placed them in this space of relative zone, of this place of zone of non-beingness. So the fight wasn't necessarily to become white for many of these groups. It was just not to be treated like Black people. And this is what Sylvia Wynter's picking up on the heels of the brutality against Rodney King in the 1990s, early 1990s. So I think that should cover, again, the idea of recognition, just to kind of give you a little bit more insight onto that. Think representation, the motivation behind it, the desire, need, and will to be seen and recognized by others. It's part of us as a species. We need this recognition. But recognition gone too far, right, for Fanon, is narcissism, that God complex. People losing their, going crazy over semantics, over words. And words are the building blocks of civilization. Words are power. But words are also subjective truth. They are social constructs. So think about a society as Du Bois intimated in the Talented TED article. Think about a society where my pronouns had much more to do with what I did than this claim of who I am. Because what I do says much more about me and my character of who I am than anything I can say. So Du Bois was championing not I am this claim, but he was more invested in this idea of what are you doing with your life? The work of schools, intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and of the relation relation of men to it. This is the curriculum of higher education, which must underlie true life. That's in the opening paragraph to the Talented TED article. Think about this, what Fanon says, toward a new humanism, a new reality, a new modernity. That's the horizon, not to replicate this version, a new version, understanding among men, our colored brothers, mankind, I believe in you, race prejudice, to understand and to love. What if those were the things we lost our shit about and not the many ways we get anxious or we lose, go crazy or just get discombobulated, disoriented. And the things of what are we fighting for? Humanity or my version of humanity? This is the task. This is what they're up to. And this is the task of I argue, the task of the Black intellectual, to keep pounding and pressing. And this is the burden of the Black intellectual. This is the burden of those who are attempting to take advantage of this arid region, this naked declivity. I argue we have nothing else to lose. If you have any questions, post it in the forum, use the forums to support each other through this process. And then again, I will chime in as needed. All right. Take care.